Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. We're excited to bring you this courtesy of the funding from the South Carolina Forestry Commission and the U.S. Forest Service. We're going to begin with a quick overview of what we'll be covering today, and then we will have our speakers Matthew Lee and Darren Green take over from there. So I think that's all I need to say for that. Here's a little housekeeping for us. So my name's Karen Firehawk, and I'll be your moderator for today. All attendees are muted automatically during the webinar, but if you would like to ask a question, you'll see in the top right of your screen, there is a little box with a question mark in it. That's the question panel. You can type a question there at any time during the webinar. If we can answer it live, we will. If not, we will wait until the speakers have concluded and then they'll take on your questions directly. You'll also have the chance to ask questions with your voice instead of just typing it, especially if you don't like typing. So you'll just use the raised hand feature, and I'll remind you of this at the end, but the raised hand feature is down on the bottom left. And so we'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. We will also record this webinar, so the recording will be made available to everyone within 24 hours following the webinar. You'll get a link that says register to hear the recording. That's just how it operates. It just lets you click a link and then you can listen to the recording. And then we'll also make available a copy of the slide deck as well. So don't worry too much about trying to take notes very quickly, because as we said, both the recording and the slide deck will be made available to everyone who's participating. Those who are interested in receiving ISA credits, that information will be shared at the end, so you can learn how to get those credits. All right, so with that, next slide. All right, and as I said at the beginning, thanks again to our sponsors. We are the Green Infrastructure Center, and we're a nonprofit, and we are able to host these events through grants. So the U.S. Forest Service provided a grant to the South Carolina Forestry Commission, and they in turn, excuse me, provided a grant to us to put on these series of webinars. This is the second webinar in our series of 4. If you missed the first one, that is available, and they have 2 more coming up, one on debris management on March 19th, and then also post-storm recovery on April 16th. And I'll just note that there's a lot of information out there on how to respond and how to prepare, but there's not a lot out there on recovery. So we're excited to also be able to bring you that topic. Next slide. All right, and as we said, these are your folks for today who are bringing this presentation to you. That's myself, Karen Firehawk, on the left. In the middle is Matthew Lee, the Director of Forest Conservation for the Green Infrastructure Center, and then also Darren Green. And Matt, I'll let you say a little bit about the Green Infrastructure Center and then ask Darren to say a little bit about Alexandria, Louisiana. Oh, Matt, you're muted still.
Thank you, Karen. So the Green Infrastructure Center, we are a nonprofit organization. We help communities evaluate and map their green assets, like their urban forest resources and their tree canopy, to really maximize the ecological, economic, and cultural values. So we not only create data like land cover and canopy maps, but we also work with communities to apply the data in a strategic way. So integrating it into their daily and long range planning. And then we do a lot of programming, educational programming, like this through a series of webinars or writing of guides or educational materials to be able to provide the information and resources for communities, help spread the information. And then we have with us Darren Green from the city of Alexandria, Louisiana, and I'll let him talk a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Matt. So I am a city employee. I am the city landscape architect and urban forester. I do have some experience with storms, actually more experience than I would like to have, both on the good side and the bad side. So we're a typical town, 50,000 people, cover about 29 square miles, so we're very spread out. We are about an hour and a half north of the Gulf of Mexico. So we don't get catastrophic damage, but we do get some fairly significant winds and destruction from hurricanes. And that's kind of what I bring to this presentation is kind of the boots on the ground experience.
Okay, thanks very much, Darren. Next. All right, so the Green Infrastructure Center has a variety of different publications. If you'd like to know more about planning for nature as green infrastructure, we have a book, Strategic Green Infrastructure Planning, and it looks at every scale from um, counties to cities to towns to site. And then we have books on green infrastructure modeling, such as that green book there to the right. And that really gets into the GIS side of it. We've also covered a lot of different topics in using nature as infrastructure. So we looked at how trees can be used to offset stormwater runoff. We've published a number of publications on community forest mitigation planning, looking at how to prepare and recover from storms. We've got some simple brochures. And then we also have done a lot of work with helping create forest conservation even when landscapes are developing. So we have a guide for developers there. And then we also study large landscapes, so looking at entire coasts. So for those of you in South Carolina, we did a study of the resiliency of coastal forests. But if you're interested in any of these, you can go online to our website and download them. Most of our publications are totally free. All right, next slide. All right, so today with the agenda, we're going to cover trends and why plan. We're going to talk about storm readiness. We're going to have a case study from Alexandria, Louisiana, from Darren. And we're going to talk about standing contracts, debris hauling, monitoring, hazard tree mitigation, disposal. What are your first steps to get started? Tips on requirements and best practices, and also resources, all in the scope of just 50 minutes. So I'm going to leave it to our able speakers to take it away from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, so we wanted to start this presentation off of, why does it matter? And, what is the data and the trends showing us for disasters in America? So for trends, there's about 6 times more billion-dollar severe storms during 2001 to 2022, so 142 events, than the prior 2 decades, which had about 25 events between 1980 and 2000. And that's just severe storms. So we're not talking about ice storms or flooding or wildfires. This is just looking at severe storms. And you can see in this map here, this is data that is hosted by NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They have combined all of these statistics for the entire US by different disaster categories. And so they also have the data displayed in maps where you can see kind of where the hardest hit regions are for storms, severe storms in the US, and where those billion-dollar storms are really happening. And so obviously Texas is getting hit pretty hard. The average cost of billion-dollar severe storms rose from an average of 2.5 billion during that 1980 to 2000 timeframe to 15.4 billion between 2001 and 2022. You can access a lot of this data at those links. The scientific research is also really indicating that rainfall rates are likely to increase, with studies modeling between a 10 to 15% increase in rainfall rates within 100 kilometers of the storm if we examine this under a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. And under that same scenario, storm intensity is likely to increase by 1 to 10%. So this implies an increase in the destructive potential per storm, assuming no reduction in storm size. So increased precipitation, which can lead to other exacerbating factors such as tree throw or flooding, which causes additional property damage, to even just the increasing intensity of the winds for those particular storms. So it's really critical that we start to do more to and do better at preparing and planning for these types of storm events. And in particularly, we're focused in on managing debris, vegetation debris, and managing urban forest resources. One, to minimize property damage and liability, but also to maximize the retention and loss, or maximize the retention of tree canopy after a storm, so we're not losing as much canopy over time, because our green infrastructure assets are providing a lot of benefits to the community: stormwater mitigation, urban heat island, carbon sequestration, reducing air pollution, just to name a few. And so it's really important that we keep that canopy cover intact as best we can, or minimize those losses. The planning of this also really helps to improve local, state, and federal information sharing. So it's really important to have those coordinated response plans in place in order to make sure that communities get back on their feet, and there's as little disruption to them as possible. It can also help us identify capacity or areas of need. So, no community is perfect at planning. And so this is an opportunity to kind of identify gaps in the planning process, and where maybe resources are needed in times of a disaster. This can also really help us get a better hold of where critical infrastructure is in the community, and what potential risks there are to that critical infrastructure. So the last thing we need is the power to go out, for there not to be any clean drinking water, for roads to be blocked. And so really making sure that those critical infrastructure components are still functioning and resilient in the face of these storms. And then most importantly, it's also about getting reimbursed for these costs. So we're talking about billion-dollar events. Even at the low, of course that's at a state level, but even at or a regional level, but even at a local level, these debris management costs can balloon up into the millions of dollars, even for small communities. And so if you are a part of a federally declared disaster, it's very critical that you get reimbursed by FEMA for those cleanup expenses, because otherwise your community is on the hook for those cleanup costs if FEMA is not reimbursing you. So, more reasons why to plan. The price of being unprepared can be enormous. So, between 2000 and 2010, FEMA and local governments spent more than $8 billion in disaster-generated debris removal costs. So that's just in removing the debris that's in blocking and getting things back to normal for your community. FEMA estimated debris removal operations account for approximately 27% of disaster recovery costs. And just as a recent example, Hurricane Idalia is anticipated to have a range between $2.5 billion to $4 billion, although some estimates take it up as high as to $9.36 billion. So again, these storms you're seeing are being very expensive. Just in this one hurricane, estimates are in the $9 billion range. And of course, debris removal and cleanup in some of those communities is still an ongoing effort. So there's kind of some core pieces to storm readiness, and we are really focusing on this as separate webinars, but there's many ways you can better prepare your community. But the top ways are really conduct a tree risk assessment of public trees. We talked about this at the last webinar that we hosted in January. We can make that recording available to you all if you were not able to attend that session, but really talking about how to minimize risk in the first place, making sure that that urban forest and tree canopy is well taken care of, so that it's less likely to fail during the event of a severe storm. Focusing in on today's, where we're really talking about these standing contracts, or sometimes known as advanced readiness or pre-contracts. Working to develop a debris management plan and estimating and establishing a debris management site. So this is a location where the material is taken and processed before being finally disposed of, and that can be a key component to any response plan. And we'll talk about that at the next webinar that we're hosting in March. And then finally, for storm readiness, holding a mock event annually. So, is a thing, such as staff turnover, and people always need a refresher on what is the plan during a response, just so that we can move more quickly and efficiently when the real thing happens. And so holding some kind of mock event annually can really help to solidify that so everybody's on the same page. And if there's anybody new to the community, they are able to understand kind of what's the response when a storm happens. But today we're really going to be focusing on these standing contracts, or also called advanced readiness or pre-contract. So if you hear those other terms, we're talking about all of the same things. And what these are, they're contracts established before a stormwater event between municipalities and private firms that specialize in these services. So the contract allows a community to bid out and select qualified contractors when there's time to have a bid process and negotiate. So you're not having to get an emergency procurement exemption from the governor's office, to be able to hire someone to respond in these situations and help with the cleanup costs. You're finding qualified contractors. You're going through the proper channels, the proper vetting that's necessary, not only for responsible procurement, but also to meet the requirements that FEMA has for these pre-contracts and for making sure that this work is done appropriately. So some of the reasons why you should have these pre-contracts in place is it avoids delays. Response times are faster. Some of these communities, the contractor will contact you in advance saying, hey, we're watching this storm. We're keeping an eye on it. It could be going towards your community, but we're on standby. And so they can deploy pretty rapidly, versus if you don't have anybody identified to help with those cleanups, you're having to scramble to find even just qualified contractors who have the equipment to help you with the cleanup and response. It can affect your federal reimbursement, which is key. So FEMA, as everybody knows, has a lot of rules and regulations, and so it takes you want to make sure that you are following the letter of the law exactly, so that you're not jeopardizing that reimbursement. It allows for more diversion away from landfills. So landfills are really the kind of the last option of how you want to be disposing this material, particularly the vegetative material. Ideally, you are finding other ways to dispose this material from going into the landfill. And it can reduce that canopy loss post-event. So you're having specifications in there that are helping these contractors be able to avoid taking out or making unnecessary cuts or removals to the tree canopy. And then there's no obligation unless you need these services. So you're not on the hook unless you're actually using the services that are provided. So it's a great way to have these contracts in place. It allows for you to have that immediate and response time. You're getting qualified contractors. You're not having to worry about potentially your federal reimbursement, because you have qualified contractors in place doing the work. But you're not on the hook for paying out for any services unless you absolutely need them. So GIC ended up doing some research into pre-contracts and storm debris cleanup response efforts, and we were introduced to Darren Green from the city of Alexandria, and we ended up writing a case study with Darren about the work that he has done over his career working for the city of Alexandria. So as he mentioned, they're a community that's a little inland from the Gulf of Mexico, but they have been hit by multiple major Category 4 storms over the last 10 to 20 years. And Darren has been working with the city over that time period, and he's learned a lot between the different types of storms and the type of response that the city did during that time. And so we wrote a case study. You can find the link here when we share the slide deck with you, where you can read more about it. But I'm going to turn it over to Darren here just to talk a little bit about Alexandria itself and some of his experiences with storm cleanup.
Thanks, Matt. So yes, in 2008, we had I had been with the city about 6 or 7 years, and we had our first big hurricane. And so it came through, and there was debris everywhere. The roads were blocked. People couldn't get in their driveways. Just a general mess. So as people will do, they pulled all their debris to the curb, and piled it up. And we went through with our public works staff and kind of pushed everything out of the way and got the electricity turned back on. And then we had all these windrows of limbs and leaves and pine straw and just littering the city. So we hired a couple of local contractors who had bobcats and trailers and dump trucks and those sorts of pieces of equipment, and we picked it all up. Fortunately, we did have a site where we could take it all, um, and that site was actually already pre-permitted. So we took it there, piled it up, and then we hired someone to come in and reduce it by grinding. So we were very proud of ourselves and thought we had done a good job. And then FEMA showed up. Um, and so they started on what they call a project worksheet, which is basically a task that they go through before they reimburse you for their costs or for your costs. So they immediately started asking for pictures of the debris piles and GPS locations of said piles and things like loading tickets. And we were just kind of flabbergasted because we had none of that. Um, and so at first they told us we weren't going to get reimbursed for anything because we had not monitored the entire process. And we basically had no paperwork other than invoices for what people had charged us for the cleanup. What they ultimately did was measured our mulch pile because we all knew the mulch pile didn't just fall from the sky, that it was a legitimate mulch pile. And so they measured it and they calculated backwards from there how much debris it might have taken to create that mulch. And they reimbursed us kind of the going rate um, for that debris pickup. And then told us in no uncertain circumstances that uh, that would not happen again. That for the next storm we had to be ready. So I immediately went and found FEMA school. So I attended FEMA training, did a lot of reading, contacted other cities, and we got ready. And we got pre-storm contracts in place. And as we go through this presentation, I'll talk about some of the nuances of those. But anyway, we got ready, and thank goodness because in 2020, Laura hit. It's the worst hurricane that has ever hit Louisiana, um, and it's the worst one we've ever had. And it was devastating. And 2 days after the storm hit, we had contractors here cleaning up. We had a monitor um, doing all the paperwork. We spent close to $4 million cleaning up, um, and about another million on monitoring. But we were the first city in the state to get everything cleaned up after Hurricane Laura. And in fact, there were much larger cities, much closer to the coast, who had no pre-event contracts, who had no debris sites permitted. They had no clue what to do. And months after the storm, they were still trying to figure out how to clean the mess up. So I learned the hard way, but we got everything in order, and I'm just glad to be able to share this with other people because I don't want other folks to have to go through what I did because it was quite embarrassing. So,
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, so as we go through these, I'm going to talk about, some of the types of contracts that are out there and provide a little bit of context for some of the information that you should be aware of. And then Darren's really going to follow up with some of the nuances of his experience and what lessons he's learned as he's gone through this work firsthand. So many small and medium-sized jurisdictions, existing procurement and contracting policies do not meet federal standards. And so there's certain types of pre-contracts that you should have in place when we're talking about a storm cleanup response effort. So one is just hauling the debris, and this can be hauling debris by specific types. So there's different types of debris, and they need to be treated separately through different contracts. So there's vegetative debris, which we're really focusing in here on, which is the mulching, the tree, the limbs, the trunk. But there's also other demolition debris. There's hazardous waste, etc. And then there's also specific types of hauling operations, and Darren can talk a little bit about this here in a minute, but considering the difference between hauling debris away from the right of way versus specific public properties that may have other logistical considerations. There's also the monitoring of the debris, and we can't really emphasize this enough, but this is a really key component. It really takes a specialized set of training to make sure that the debris is monitored appropriately, and this is really where FEMA emphasizes the monitoring because there is surprisingly a lot of fraud in cleanup operations. And so the monitoring really helps to make sure that the cleanup efforts are being followed, protocols are being followed, and that the metrics and the tickets and other things, the evidence, the documentation that's being reported is accurate. Hazard tree mitigation. So this is making sure that those tree removals or any pruning for a hazardous limb is making sure to be taken care of to reduce those within the public right of way and on public property. And then disposal, where's that in material going? And there's quite a variety of ways you can dispose of the vegetative debris. You can chip it down, you can compost it, you can burn it, or you can landfill it, which is kind of the least desirable way of disposing of the material. So, Dan, I think you actually had a really interesting story about the different types of hauling debris. Like you had some differences in logistics around hauling debris from the right of way versus hauling debris from the zoo.
Yeah, so when we were cleaning up from Hurricane Laura, these as you see this truck here in this picture, that's kind of the typical implement that's used. Those are what we call double buggies. So it's a truck with a trailer and a grapple that's mounted between the two buggies or the two trailers. And they go along the street, and it's a very efficient operation. They pick up debris that's curbside and throw it in the back of the truck, and when it's full, they go dump it and come back. And it works great, and they can move a lot of debris very quickly. Well, we have an interesting situation where about a third of our city, um, and it happens to be where most of the trees are. We have alleys, and they're like 8 to 10 feet wide. Well, you can't fit this truck down that alley, and even if you could, they're full of utilities. There's um, cable lines and phone lines and internet fiber, and so we could not get to that debris. And then we have a zoo, which is kind of the only way you can get in there is with a golf cart or a wheelbarrow. And so the contractor, and rightfully so, kind of said, look, we're not picking up that debris for the price we gave you. We can't do it. So we did some addendums to the contract where they were able to bring in bobcats and grab the debris in the alleys, pull it to the nearest cross street, and then picked it up as they normally would. Same with the zoo. We fortunately had some volunteers from other zoos who got a lot of that debris out, but the rest of it we had to bring it out with very small bobcats. Made a large pile, and then once it was piled near the street or where the trucks could get to, it became traditional debris. This could also happen in some of your parks or natural areas or drainage areas. Places where you just don't have a road or any sort of infrastructure that can support these trucks. So think about all those unique situations that you have, and create a separate unit price and a separate scope of work for that. Describe how you want that done in your specifications, and then get a separate cost for it. And then the monitors just monitor it separately because it's done at a different cost.
Great. Thank you. So those debris hauling contracts really cover the picking up of the debris, transporting it to that management site, so that debris management site where it goes through that processing. The debris is then processed or reduced. Sometimes you might hear it referred to that, where you're taking the bulk of that material and you're shrinking it down through the chipping or mulching process. And then it's the final transportation from the debris management site to the disposal facility. Some things to think about when you're developing these debris contracts for hauling is request for the contractor qualifications, experience, and proof of insurance. You want to make sure to limit the number of passes a contractor can make to collect debris before resuming the normal local collection schedule, and make sure to verify and limit the passes to the number eligible for FEMA reimbursement. So FEMA likes to see an end date on the number of passes that are going to happen to collect debris. So it's not just open-ended, constant debris collection. Create separate contracts for construction debris versus that vegetation debris disposal, because they are going to have different kind of qualifications and specifications for those types of debris. Negotiate and credit the value of any salvageable debris materials with the contractor within the contract terms. And this is something that FEMA likes to see, or wants to see, is if the debris collector is going to take any salvageable materials and then resell it, you need to be making sure that that price is reflected in the unit cost that you're having them pick up the material for, because they're ultimately going to be reselling that material for value. And then specify all publicly managed lands, such as parks, cemeteries, zoos, alleyways, or canals, and the special considerations and limitations of those sites in the RFP. So those really great examples that Darren talked about with the alleyways and the zoo.
The other thing I would recommend, if you have not had a storm, be it a hurricane or an ice storm, is uh, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has some pretty accurate debris models that you can run. And I would suggest running a worst case scenario, which would be an early year, slow moving storm. So leaf on. So when the leaves are on the trees, you're obviously going to have a lot more debris. If it's moving slow, you're going to have a lot more debris. And if it's a wet storm, you're going to have more debris because you're going to have more tip overs. So run those numbers and kind of use those numbers in your specifications or in your unit costs to give the contractor an idea of whether you're talking about, is this like a 2 week operation with 4 trucks, or is this a 5 week operation with 50 trucks? So it kind of gives them an idea of the scope or the magnitude of what they might be looking at.
Yeah, and if you join us for the next webinar on establishing debris management sites, we'll share with you that Army Corps of Engineer calculation so that you can calculate that for yourself. So if you want to learn more about that Darren just talked about, we're also going to talk about that at the next webinar. For monitoring debris contracts, the monitoring services, RFP, and standing contracts should be separate and independent of all other contracts to avoid any conflict of interest. Monitoring is a time-intensive activity that requires a well-trained team. So simply relying on city staff to perform monitoring after a major storm event is really unrealistic. City staff are going to be more critical at coordinating resources and be able to provide additional support for the cleanup response, and just don't have the training or the time to really be monitoring the trucks that are coming into the site and the mitigation work that's happening all across the city. Several monitors will be needed. So one monitor to really track each debris cleanup truck as it comes into the facility, another to process the truck's debris load, and additional monitors actually manage the debris management site. So there's certain environmental regulations around a debris management site and certain testing and monitoring that needs to happen. And so you're going to need additional monitors to make sure that you're in compliance with state and federal law. There's also third-party monitors are also essential for tracking the cleanup and disposal effort. So you're talking about a lot of additional staffing that's needed, and you can't really rely on existing municipal staff to perform these types of services during a major event.
So just to kind of reiterate that, FEMA will let you self-monitor, and some people have done it before. But if you think about, so after Laura, we had at the peak we had 50 trucks running through our city, and so you would need a monitor for each of those trucks. Those trucks have to be certified before they're put on the road, so they have to be measured in, in terms of how much debris they'll hold. You've got to put placards on them. You got to number them. They all have GPS trackers on them, so that you can determine where they're at any point in the day. So that's 50 people there. Then you need a couple of people in a tower. And then when you start grinding this debris, you've got to quantify how much you put into the end and how much comes out of the grinder. So that's 3 or 4 more people. Um, and they want, when you're picking up your debris, even they want a GPS location of the pile of where the truck was parked when it picked up the debris. They want pictures of the debris piles, and it's the technology that would be required and the manpower to do that would just be, to me, overwhelming. Um, and then when you start your recovery process and start doing your hangers and leaners, you're going to need monitors for that as well. Now FEMA will reimburse you, but only for your overtime. So if you're doing this as part of your normal straight time, 8 hours a day, you do not get reimbursed for this. So, but if you pay a monitor to do this, that's reimbursable at the same rate that your storm debris is reimbursed at. So I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of this.
So when you're thinking about monitoring debris contracts, monitoring companies should be trained in FEMA protocols and qualified to submit the necessary paperwork. And as Darren mentioned, a skilled and reputable monitoring team is really crucial to a successful cleanup effort. Um, a monitor who fails to provide the appropriate documentation may jeopardize the FEMA reimbursement process. So really, of all the contracts, the monitoring contract is kind of one of the most important, because if the monitoring is not done adequately, then that could jeopardize potential reimbursement. According to audits done by the Office of Inspector General, debris cleanups lacking proper debris monitoring are susceptible to fraud and overcharges by disreputable contractors. Something to keep in mind, and this is coming directly from FEMA's Public Assistance Grant Program and Policy Guide. You might see some terms that contractors will use. FEMA approved contractor rates. So FEMA does not certify, credential, or recommend contractors. So if you see this kind of language in a bid, you know that that is not true. FEMA eligibility determinations. Debris contractors do not have the authority to make eligibility determinations. Only FEMA can make an eligibility determination. And then finally, FEMA training and eligibility documentation and project worksheet development provided. These services often have a fee attached. However, most of the training and information offered by a contractor is available free from FEMA or from your state emergency management office. So, if you see someone try to attach additional fees for value added services such as FEMA training and documentation, just know that they're really trying to upcharge you there, because all of this training is really made available free by FEMA or your state emergency management agency.
So the big recommendation here is remember that the monitor works for the city or the county or the parish or the park district or whatever government entity is hiring them. They work for you. They do not work for the contractor. Their role is to represent you in your contractual relationship with the debris contractor. So it's just like hiring an architect to build a building or an engineer to build a bridge. They're the owner's rep, and their allegiance is to you. Um, it was interesting to watch the relationship between our monitor and our contractor when we cleaned up after Hurricane Laura. Um, it was clear that they had worked together before and that they knew each other. And at times they were friendly and jovial with each other. But I also saw instances where when the contractor tried to stretch things a little far, or when the contractor was unsure about whether something was eligible or not, the debris monitors exerted their authority, and the contractor respected it. So just keep that in mind, that there are two separate entities, and the the monitor is your representative in that whole process, because ultimately they're going to turn in all the paperwork that gets you your reimbursement, and it's their reputation that's on the line. So keep that in mind as you go through these in the future.
Hazard tree mitigation contracts. So these are contracts for hazard tree mitigation, which can involve the removal of trees, branches, or other tree parts that pose an immediate threat to public safety or public property. If this work is contracted out, it is typically done on a per tree basis. For hazard mitigation contracts, make sure that to select a contractor that has certified arborists on staff who will be conducting the tree mitigation work. And ideally, those certified arborists will have knowledge of the local or regional tree species. FEMA has criteria on what it considers a hazardous tree or tree part, and you want to include these definitions and specifications in the scope of work to make sure that that mitigation work is following these particular specifications, because FEMA will not reimburse for parts or tree parts that don't meet these specifications.
So another really important thing to think about. Um, Once the debris is about halfway picked up, your contractor will bring in an arborist team to start dealing with leaners and hangers. And so hangers are hazardous broken limbs that are hanging over the right of way or could bounce into the right of way if they fell, and those sorts of things. So it's a public safety issue. Um, Leaners are trees that have a certain degree of lean, or they are damaged to the point where they will not recover in the long term. Someone is going to have to decide which of those trees have to come out. And I'll give you a perfect example. We had some live oaks in our city, which is one of our most popular trees, that to the novice, they look to be dead or gone. And the contractor was wanting to know if we should take them all out. Ultimately, we made the decision to leave them because my experience tells me that those trees will recover. They'll put out suckers. They may not be the best looking trees in the world, but they will recover. the flip side of that is we had some water oaks that were close to meeting the criteria for having enough crown loss to be eligible for removal. And we decided that on those that were close for that particular species, that we would go ahead and take them out, because as you probably know, they're just not a desirable tree species to have in an urban area. So think about either describing that process in your specifications, or being prepared to do that once the contractor shows up. If you don't have a staff arborist or someone who could do that, um, you could contract with a consulting arborist to help you work through that process. But if you don't make the decision, the contractor will make it for you. And I would suspect that they would probably lean on the side of taking more trees down than maybe they need to, because it creates debris, which is what they're there to pick up. So give that some thought.
And then the final contract is a disposal contract, and you really want to consider what options exist for disposal of debris in your community. So debris disposal for vegetative debris is going to look a lot different than construction debris or hazardous waste. So consider kind of what relationships exist in the community and definitely have contingency plans in place. So vegetative debris is typically going to be a larger volume of debris post disaster, depending on the type of disaster, and must be processed before disposal. And so, some typical ways that vegetative debris is disposed of is composting, mulching, burning, and landfill.
So ultimately, we ended up giving ours away. Um, we did have to pay for some of the trucking, but we knew we did not want to landfill it. We could not burn it because the site that we were processing it on was not permitted for burning, because of its proximity to residential areas and a hospital. So we ended up giving half of it to our Department of Transportation, and they used it for erosion control mulch along the interstate. And the other half we gave to a local contractor who had a source, or had a contract with a paper mill, and so they used it for boiler fuel. I will caution you, if you sell it, um, let's say you sell it and you make $150,000 selling it, FEMA will subtract that money from your reimbursement. So you're really better off just giving it away. Um, Composting is a good idea, but I would suggest that you check with your local, or with your state agency, and make sure that you have the proper permits to do that. And just remember that composting is a long-term commitment. It's not something you're going to do in a few months. So think about if you need the property for something else, or if you have another storm and you've got tons of compost piled up and now you can't get to your site. Okay.
So those are the different types of contracts. So you might be asking, well, like, how do I even start developing my standing contract so that my community can be ready? So we have some materials. We've also highlighted some ways that you could get started, both from Darren's experience, but also from research of other communities who have done this type of work. So one of the best ways is to really start by researching other cities of a similar size and exposure to natural disasters as to your community. So other municipalities of your size and exposure will have some of the similar problems, similar maybe development footprint, etc. And so you can really start to see what other communities may have already that you can rely on for your specifications in your contract. Also, it's really key to research what is required by FEMA in the elements in your contract, along with what are state elements that are required for procurement. You really want to involve your procurement specialist and your legal staff early into the process. So you don't want to just go and draft the whole thing and then hand it over to procurement. You really want to be able to understand what elements are needed in a contract, and these additional colleagues and staff will help you understand what legal and procurement requirements are needed in your contracts. Connect with your emergency manager both at the local and state level. They're great resources. They're also very familiar with FEMA regulations and disaster cleanup and response. They will be able to help you review your contracts or be able to help provide feedback on ways to make them better. And then a pro tip, attend a multi-day FEMA training. So there are opportunities for you to go to trainings and be able to learn more about this content directly from FEMA.
Yeah, and that's how I started. I took the debris management for state, local, and tribal officials. I think it is offered online now, so you don't have to travel and spend a week in Emmitsburg, Maryland, like I did. Um, the other thing I would suggest is when you're looking for model specifications to use to develop your own, do a little research and find out if an entity that has gone through a storm before has issued new specifications since having gone through that storm. I would say that their specifications are probably going to be much better because they will have learned from their mistakes than someone who just got some boilerplate specifications and scopes of work and not have gone through a storm yet. So that's a little pro tip that that I would advise you to remember.
Some other best practices for standing contracts, particularly the criteria for federally compliant contracts, include, and now this is not an exhaustive list, it would be too many slides to have all of the requirements on here, but we're going to give you some of the highlights. It must be of reasonable cost and competitively bid and comply with federal, state, and local procurement standards. Um, have bidders list lawsuits they've been subjected to and make sure bids are both least cost and most qualified. So cost must be a price select or selection criteria for the RFP. You can score and rank applications on an established set of criteria, which kind of helps you get at finding the most qualified contractors, but price must be a selection criteria for the RFP. That is key. Required that to state that the contractor is subject to FEMA reporting requirements, so that FEMA is able to get the proper documentation reporting from those contractors. And for contracts over $100,000, must follow minimum bonding requirements from this subsection part.
My advice here is do not take the low bid. Um, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I have found that you get what you pay for in life. In most cases, your middle person is probably, in price wise, is going to be the best. But look at all the other criteria you come up with: ability to respond, how many lawsuits do they have, all those things, and use price as part of it, but certainly not all of it.
Absolutely. Other tips and best practices. So don't piggyback off of existing contracts. So if you already have contracts with waste management haulers, or um, you already have a contract with an arborist, don't piggyback off of those existing contracts for these pre-contracts. You need to go through a separate request for proposal and competitively bid it out. FEMA does not like piggybacking off of existing contracts, and they can deny your reimbursements. Contracts should contain a not to exceed clause. And don't use time and material contracts. Just don't use them. FEMA will only reimburse for time and material contracts under the public assistance grants for up to 70 hours of emergency work. And as Darren talked about, it can take months for a cleanup to happen. And so you're going to burn through those 70 hours pretty quickly just in the first week. So don't use time and material contracts. And then do your homework to properly vet contractors. Make sure to check references and verify that they have all of the appropriate licensures.
Yeah, call people they've worked for before, because all these contractors will tell you that all their clients are happy. And when you call their clients, you make it a different story. So call those folks they've worked for before. They'll tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so once you have the different pieces or elements in your contract, start writing it up. Research those guidelines, talk to your procurement officers, make sure that the legal language is there and is understood. Include your community's unique needs and considerations that, Darren had talked about specifically for Alexandria. Share the documents and get feedback from your local emergency management department as well as other municipal staff, and then release the RFP or bids with adequate response time allotted. So you're not trying to rush this out before the hurricane season. You're getting this out so that you have enough time to get enough qualified applicants and to review them in an adequate amount of time. RFP should already have a system in place to weigh experience, qualifications, and cost in order to award a contract that complies with FEMA requirements. So don't release the RFP and then create the scoring criteria later. And then when you release the RFP, make sure that you have created the appropriate listing categories for qualified, so that qualified contractors can find it. It also helps a lot if a locality does a robust advertising announcement. This can help you generate enough qualified applicants out of the pool.
And my last pro tip, from the School of Hard Knocks: release these contracts in the winter. We had a situation several years ago where our contract expired, and because we had a computer hack, we were not able to rebid them for several months, and that was right in the middle of hurricane season. So you don't want these things expiring, whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year. You don't want them expiring June the 17th when hurricane season is about to hit. Time them so that you're awarding them in the winter, so that you don't have any issues with not having a contractor in place.
Very good point. So just in summary, storm readiness equals better storm response. Standing contracts result in faster deployment times and greater reimbursement rate by FEMA. The standing contracts that specify arborists can reduce your overall tree loss, and mitigation can reduce overall liability from damage. And these contracts can really help with better coordination amongst departments and governments to lead to more efficient response times in that cleanup effort. We really just want to highlight some additional resources for you all. So there's the Community Forestry Academy. This was developed by the Southern Group of State Foresters. There's a series of free training videos, including why a community should plan for storms, as well as additional free resources and guides for developing plans and assessments. The link is there. You can follow that to find more information and resources. And then, of course, there's also a lot of resources on GIC's website under our resiliency page. We have a storm mitigation planning page where you can find a lot of these materials to help you get started and provide additional context and information about standing contracts. So we are almost out of time. I don't know if we have any time for final questions or comments. I'll let Karen speak to that here in a second, but I do, for the folks that do have to get off of the webinar,